She understands nothing of consequence. Richard Winthrop sat at his own dinner table, his mistress's hand folded inside his wife seated 6 chairs away, like a guest in her own home. Helen Langford Winthrop did not flinch. She had stopped flinching years ago. But that night when the Russian ambassador walked through the door, past every powerful man in that room, and bowed to her, Richard Winthrop learned the cost of every year he had spent underestimating the woman he married. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by someone who should have seen you clearest, stay with us. Subscribe and let this story remind you what quiet strength looks like when it finally steps into the light. The summer of 1817 arrived in Albemarle County with the kind of heat that pressed itself into the tobacco fields and refused to lift until well past sundown. The roads from Charlottesville were thick with dust. The river low, and the great houses along the ridge sat behind their white columns, like men holding their breath, composed, deliberate, unwilling to show discomfort to anyone who might be watching. Winthrop Estate was the finest of them. Richard Winthrop had made sure of that. The house had been his grandfather's first, a modest structure of 4 rooms and good timber, but Richard had rebuilt it in his 20s with money made from tobacco contracts and a timber arrangement with merchants in Baltimore. He had added the east wing, the formal dining room, the imported chandelier from a Philadelphia auction house, and the wide front porch that could be seen from the main road. He was proud of it, in the way men are proud of things they believe they built alone completely without acknowledging the hands that helped or the ground they were given to stand on. Howe was 39 years old and had been married to Helen for 6 years. He had stopped seeing her sometime around year 2. Not cruelly, not with intention, or so he would have told himself. He simply got busy. The estate expanded. The Baltimore contracts grew complicated. A man named Hargrove tried to dispute the eastern timber boundary, and Richard spent 14 months in legal correspondence over 40 acres. He didn't strictly need, but could not bring himself to concede. Through all of it, Helen managed the household accounts, organized. The seasonal staff corresponded with the merchants who supplied the kitchens and appeared at his side at every dinner, every riding party, every church service in a dress that was always appropriate, and a manner that was always composed. Richard called her reliable. He meant it as a compliment. He didn't understand it was a diminishment. Clara Bennett had entered his life the previous autumn. She was the widow of a merchant from Richmond, housed temporarily with her cousin in Charlottesville, while her husband's estate was sorted through the courts. She was witty and quick. Her laughter, immediate, her attention fixed on Richard with a focus that felt to a man who had stopped being truly seen in his own home, like sunlight after a long winter. He knew what people said. Virginia was not a large world, and the gentry of Albemarle County kept their social circles tight as a fence line. People talked. He had heard the whispers. He had chosen these past months to stop caring about them. Tonight was the night he stopped hiding. He had told himself he was simply hosting a dinner. 20 guests, the formal table, the good silver, the French wine he'd been holding for a suitable occasion. He had told himself Clara's presence was nothing remarkable. She was a widow of respectable standing. There was no rule that said she couldn't be seated among his guests. He had told himself all of this in the precise and careful language of a man who knows he is lying. Helen had dressed for the evening in a gown of deep blue wool, her dark hair pinned without ornament, a single strand of small pearls at her throat that had belonged to her mother. She stood in the front hall when Richard came down the stairs, and she looked at him with the expression she had learned to wear, even composed, giving away nothing. "The Caldwells sent word they will be late," she said. "The younger Caldwell girl has a fever. Then we seat 12 until they arrive." He straightened his cuffs. "Clara will sit to my left." Helen was quiet for one moment, one beat. "Your left," she said. "Yes." She did not argue. She did not raise her voice or reach for his arm, or do any of the things a woman in her position might have done to remind him that the seat to a host's left was the position of honor at a Virginia dinner table, reserved for the most distinguished female guest. A position that had belonged at every dinner in that house for 6 years to his wife. She simply turned toward the dining room to supervise the final placement of the settings. Richard watched her go. He felt briefly something that might have been shame. He dismissed it. The guests arrived in the rolling way of Virginia evening's carriages on the gravel voices in the hall, the smell of good horses and better perfume drifting through the front rooms. Richard stood at the center of it all and shook hands and received compliments about the house, and said the things a man of his position was expected to say, and he watched Clara Bennett come through his front door in a gown of amber silk, and felt for one moment entirely certain that he had made the right decision. Clara moved through the room with the easy confidence of a woman who understood the precise value of being looked at. She greeted the men with warmth that stopped just short of familiarity, the women with charm that stopped just short of intimacy, and she arrived at Richard's side with a smile that was somehow both triumphant and entirely innocent. "What a remarkable house," she said. "I had forgotten how well you keep it." "Helen manages the household," Richard said, and then catching himself, "I make the larger decisions, of course." Clara's smile didn't waver. "Of course." He brought her to the table. He pulled back her chair. He sat beside her, across the table and 6 chairs down. Helen settled into her seat between old Thomas Pendleton and a young attaché from the Richmond governor's office named Marsh, who was in the county on some matter of land record. She unfolded her napkin across her lap with the practiced calm of a woman who had long since decided that her feelings were her own business. Pendleton leaned toward her. He was 71 years old, half-deaf, and had known Helen's father when they were both young men trading tobacco contracts in Richmond. He squinted at the head of the table. "Is that the Bennett widow?" "It is," Helen said. He reached for his wineglass. "Brazen business." Helen said nothing. Marsh, on her other side, was young enough to be oblivious to the undercurrents and enthusiastic about his work in a way that Helen found, despite everything, mildly charming. He was explaining something about the survey methods being used to reclassify land parcels along the county's western edge. "The difficulty," he said, "is that the original grants were issued before we had any reliable measurement standard in the Western Territories. Half the boundary lines are drawn from natural markers, this rock, that tree, that have since moved or died or been cleared entirely." "My husband has a boundary dispute in the east," Helen said. 40 acres against a neighbor named Hargrove." "I'd heard of it." Marsh nodded. "That sort of thing can drag on for years. It dragged on for 14 months. She lifted her wineglass. "It was resolved by locating an original survey document that had been misfiled in the county clerk's office in 1798. I found it." Marsh looked at her. "You went to the county records office?" 3 times, she said. "The 3rd time I brought the clerk a very specific list of what I was looking for and where I believed it had been incorrectly categorized." A pause. "He found it within the hour." The young attaché stared at her for a moment, as if recalibrating something. "Does your husband know you?" "He knows the dispute was resolved," Helen said pleasantly. "He assumed his solicitor found the document." From the far end of the table, Richard's voice carried easily over the general conversation. He was telling a story. He was always telling a story about a horse he'd purchased from a Kentucky breeder, a magnificent animal, 16 hands, spirited, but trainable. Clara was watching him with that look she had. The one that said every word he said was the most interesting thing she had ever heard. And Richard was leaning slightly toward her, in the unconscious way of a man who is being admired and cannot help moving toward the source of it. His hand resting on the tablecloth between their plates closed briefly over hers. Helen saw it. Every person at the table saw it. The conversation staggered. Pendleton cleared his throat. A woman named Margaret Forsyth, 3 seats down, suddenly became very interested in her soup. Richard did not seem to notice. Or he noticed, and had decided that noticing was no longer necessary. Clara, to her credit or discredit, did not pull her hand away. It was in this moment that the dining room door opened, and Richard's household steward appeared in the frame with the expression of a man carrying news he is not sure will be welcome. "Pardon the interruption, sir. The Russian delegation has arrived." Richard looked up. Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration quick and subtle, the look of a man who has just remembered that tonight was supposed to be about more than the woman beside him. The Russian ambassador to the United States. Pyotr Vasiliev had been traveling through Virginia for 10 days on what was described in polite correspondence as a cultural tour but was understood by everyone with any knowledge of trade politics to be a quiet assessment of American commercial interests in the Atlantic and Baltic routes. He was 62 years old, gray-bearded, and possessed of the particular stillness that belongs to men who have spent decades in rooms where everything matters. He had connections to merchant houses that reached from St. Petersburg to the Baltic ports, and his approval, or even his acknowledgement, could open doors in international commerce that most Virginia planters couldn't reach in a lifetime. Richard had spent 3 weeks arranging this introduction. He stood. Ambassador Vasiliev. He crossed to the doorway with his broadest smile. "Welcome to Winthrop Estate. We are honored." The ambassador's English was precise and slightly formal, each word placed with care. "The honor is to be received in such a distinguished household." I was accompanied by 2 members of his delegation, a young secretary and an older man whose role no one quite seemed to understand, but who watched everything with great attention. Richard began the introductions. He moved through his guests with practiced ease. Pendleton Forsyth, the other men of standing in the room, each introduction calibrated to convey the impression that Winthrop Estate was a place where important people gathered. He introduced Clara as Mrs. Bennett, a widow of the Richmond Bennets. And if there was any question about her precise position at his table, he did not invite it. He came at last to the far end of the table. "And this," he said with the particular inflection of a man performing courtesy, "is my wife, Helen. She prefers the quiet side of things." He meant it to sound fond. It did not sound fond. It sounded like an apology for her presence. Helen looked up at the ambassador with the clear level gaze she had been born with and never quite learned to soften, and she said in accented but entirely correct Russian, "Dobro pожаловать в Virginiu, господин посол." The room went very still. Vasiliev stopped. He looked at her, truly, looked the way men of experience look at something unexpected with a focus that was neither polite nor rude, but simply absolute. "You speak Russian," he said in English. "Only a little," Helen said. "My French is considerably better, though I've found that people are always more surprised by the Russian." Vasiliev's expression changed. Not dramatically, he was not a man given to drama, but something in it opened like a door pushed slightly wider. "You're French," he repeated. "My mother's family had commercial dealings with the French merchant houses in the 1790s, Helen said. "I spent a great deal of time reading their correspondence as a girl. The language came along with the contracts." "And the contracts," Vasiliev said, "interested you." "The contracts were fascinating," she said. "Much more so than what most people thought suitable reading for a girl of 12. Something that might have been a smile moved through his gray beard. Richard had not moved. He was standing at the head of the table, with the expression of a man who has just watched a perfectly rehearsed introduction veer sharply off its planned course, and he did not quite know how to redirect it. "Helen," he said with a small laugh meant to convey easy familiarity, "enjoys her reading." Nobody at the table laughed. The young attaché Marsh, who had spent the past hour sitting next to Helen, was looking at Richard with an expression that was doing its best to remain neutral and not quite succeeding. Vasiliev drew out the chair beside Helen, not his assigned seat, which was at Richard's right, and sat. "Tell me," he said, "what do you know of the Baltic routes?" The dinner rearranged itself around that question, the way a river rearranges itself around a new stone dropped at its center. Conversation at the far end of the table shifted, pulled. Men who had been making polite noise about Virginia politics and horse breeding found themselves listening without quite intending to the exchange between a Russian ambassador and a woman who had just answered a question most of them could not have answered themselves. Helen did not perform. That was what made it remarkable. She did not raise her voice or gesture dramatically, or do any of the things that might have suggested she understood the weight of the moment. She simply spoke clearly, precisely, with the ease of a woman who had been thinking about these things for a long time and was finally being asked. "The northern route is the obvious choice on a map," she said. "But the obvious choice rarely survives contact with the actual commercial agreements involved. The difficulty isn't geography. It's the arrangement between the northern merchant guilds and the English port authorities at Hull. Anyone sending cargo through Riga is paying 3 separate sets of fees: the guild levy, the port transit tax, and the informal arrangement that nobody writes down, but everybody pays. Vasiliev's eyes hadn't left her face. "And Archangel," he said. "Archangel bypasses the guild entirely," Helen said. "The northern merchants don't control that corridor the same way. The fees are cleaner. The documentation is more straightforward. And if you establish a direct relationship with the house factors there, you eliminate the middlemen who are currently taking somewhere between 12 and 18% of what should be profit." "How do you know the figure?" "Because my father's company used the Riga route for 11 years, she said, "and my father's company used the Archangel route for 4 years after I suggested the change. The difference in net return was 16% in the first year alone." There was a silence at the table. Not the silence of discomfort, the silence of attention. Richard had sat back down. He was not sure when he had sat back down. Beside him, Clara's hand had withdrawn from the tablecloth and settled in her own lap, and she was looking at something on the wall just past his shoulder with the focused expression of a woman who is very carefully not looking at the thing she is actually watching. Pendleton, who had been half asleep over his soup, was fully awake. "Your father's company," he said loudly from 3 seats down. "Langford and Sons." "Langford and daughter by the time I was involved," Helen said, and the old man made a sound that was either a laugh or a cough, but his eyes were bright. Vasiliev placed both hands flat on the tablecloth. It was a deliberate gesture, a man calling himself to a decision. "Madam Winthrop," he said, "I have in my work over the past 20 years encountered a great many people who speak knowledgeably about Atlantic and Baltic commerce." He paused. "Fewer than a dozen of them spoke as well as you have just spoken." Helen held his gaze. "I have spent 3 years," she said, "studying the correspondence your merchants sent to my father's trading house. Letters manifest contract proposals. Some of them dated back to 1801. You read merchant correspondence from the Russian trading houses." "I read everything I could find," she said simply. There was a great deal of time, and the letters were available. What she did not say, what she would not say, not at this table, not in front of these people, was that she had read them in the evenings, in the small sitting room at the back of the house after Richard had retired to his study. That she had been reading them for 3 years. That she had begun when she realized her husband was not going to ask for her opinion on his business, and she had needed something to do with the part of her mind that refused to go quiet just because it wasn't being used. Vasiliev stood. He was not a tall man, but he had a presence that occupied space in ways that height alone did not account for. He pushed back his chair, stepped around it, and walked the length of the table. He stopped beside Helen's chair, and he bowed. Not the abbreviated nod of social courtesy, a genuine bow, the kind that meant something. "I have read your name," he said, "in several commercial documents that passed through my office, references to a Langford analysis of the Baltic corridor that circulated among the merchant houses in the early part of this decade." He straightened. "I did not know Langford had a daughter. I did not know the analysis was yours." Helen said very quietly, "Very few people did." The room had gone completely silent. Richard Winthrop sat at the head of his table in the house he had built, surrounded by the guests he had invited beside the woman he had brought there to display his freedom, and he could not find a single thing to say. Clara Bennett stared at a point somewhere above the chandelier. Thomas Pendleton refilled his wine glass with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that the wisest thing he could do in this moment was stay very quiet and watch. Marsh, the young attaché, had a look on his face that was caught somewhere between astonishment and something that resembled unmistakably satisfaction. Helen unfolded her napkin in her lap. It had slipped slightly when she turned toward Vasiliev, and she set it back into place with the same composed, unhurried motion she brought to everything. Her back was straight. Her hands were still. Her expression was not triumphant and not wounded and not anything that required anyone else to respond to it. She was simply herself, exactly as she had always been. The only thing that had changed was that someone had finally asked her a question worth answering. The dinner resumed. Courses came and went. Conversation rebuilt itself unevenly around different centers than it had occupied an hour before. Vasiliev did not leave Helen's end of the table. His secretary drifted down to join them at some point, producing a small notebook with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to recording things that might matter later. Richard ate his dinner. He did not speak much. Clara beside him filled the silences with her usual lightness, a comment about the wine, a story about a cousin in Richmond, an observation about the heat. Her voice was pleasant, and her timing was good, and Richard found for the first time in months that he was not listening to her. He was listening to the other end of the table, to his wife, explaining in that clear and unhurried voice why the English port authorities at Hull had no incentive to reform their fee structure, and every incentive to maintain the appearance of reform while changing nothing. Why the guild arrangements that looked like protectionism were actually functioning more like insurance, and what that meant for any merchant house trying to break into the corridor without local relationships already in place. Why the timing of the sailing season interacted with the credit terms in ways that most analyses got completely wrong. She talked the way people talk when they have been thinking about something for a very long time in private and finally have a listener capable of understanding them. Vasiliev listened the way men listen when they have found something they were not expecting to find. When the evening finally ended, when carriages were called and coats retrieved and the formal courtesies of departure were exchanged in the front hall, Vasiliev paused at the door. He looked at Richard. "You have a remarkable household, Mr. Winthrop." A beat. "Remarkable in ways I suspect you have not yet fully appreciated." Richard said, "Thank you, Ambassador." It was the only thing he could think to say. Vasiliev's gaze moved to Helen standing 3 feet to Richard's left. "Madam." Another bow, smaller this time but no less deliberate. "I hope we will have occasion to continue this conversation." "I would welcome that," Helen said. And she meant it. The door closed. The carriages rolled. The last of the guests followed with their coats and their lowered voices, and the particular energy of people who know they have witnessed something that will be discussed for a long time. The house went quiet. Richard and Helen stood in the front hall. The candles had burned low. The dining room beyond was a soft wreckage of used crystal and half-cleared plates. The steward and the household staff had withdrawn, giving them the privacy that servants learn to manufacture at the precise moments it becomes necessary. Clara had left with a cousin who'd come as her escort. She had said her goodnight to Richard quietly, without the usual warmth, and he had felt the restraint in it like a door closing. He looked at his wife. She was still composed, still even. Her hands were at her sides, and her eyes were steady, and there was nothing in her expression that demanded anything from him. Not acknowledgement, not apology, not even the satisfaction of his discomfort. She was just standing there, being exactly who she had always been. And Richard Winthrop, standing in the house he had built, felt the full weight of 6 years come down on him at once, not like a judgment, but like a reckoning. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply arrives in a still hallway at the end of an evening and waits. He opened his mouth. He didn't know what he was going to say. He had never in 6 years of marriage had less idea of what to say to his wife. Helen looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up a candle from the hall table and walked toward the stairs. "Good night, Richard," she said. He watched her go. He didn't move until the light from her candle had disappeared around the upper landing and the hall had settled back into darkness, and he was standing alone in the house he had believed until approximately 2 hours ago that he understood completely. He understood now that he had not understood it at all. Richard Winthrop did not sleep that night. He sat in his study until the candles burned to nothing, and then he sat in the dark and he thought about the look on Pyotr Vasiliev's face when he bowed to Helen. Not the bow itself, though. That image kept returning with a persistence he found deeply unsettling, but the expression that preceded it. The moment of recognition. The way the ambassador's eyes had sharpened, the way his posture had changed, the way a man of 62 years, who had negotiated trade arrangements across 2 continents, had looked at Richard's wife and seen something Richard had spent 6 years failing to notice. He thought about what Vasiliev had said at the door. "Remarkable in ways I suspect you have not yet fully appreciated." Not a compliment, a verdict. Richard pushed back from his desk sometime before dawn and walked through the darkened house with a candle he forgot to light. moving by memory through rooms he knew so well he didn't need to see them. He passed the dining room without going in. He passed the front hall, where 4 hours ago Helen had picked up her candle and walked away from him without a backward glance, and he stopped there for a moment in the silence and tried to remember when exactly she had stopped looking back. He couldn't place it. That was the thing that disturbed him most. There was no moment he could identify, no specific evening when it had happened. It had been gradual, so gradual that he had never noticed it occurring, only arrived eventually at the finished result. A wife who no longer expected anything from him and had therefore stopped asking, stopped hoping, stopped turning around to see if he was following. He had called that peace. He understood now that it was something else entirely. By morning, he had reached no conclusions, except the obvious one, which was that he had badly misjudged the woman he'd married, and that the misjudgment had been witnessed by 20 people, including a Russian ambassador whose opinion mattered considerably in Atlantic trade circles. He was not proud of himself for noticing the professional consequences before the personal ones. But he was above all things an honest man about his own failures, or he had always believed himself to be, and honesty required him to acknowledge the order in which the realizations arrived. Clara did not come to the estate the following day, or the day after that. Richard did not send for her. I wasn't sure, sitting across from his breakfast and his wife's empty chair. Helen rose before him and took her morning meal in the small dining room off the kitchen, a habit she had developed 2 years ago that he had interpreted as preference for quiet, whether the absence of Clara felt like loss or like something closer to relief. The uncertainty troubled him more than either answer would have. Helen appeared mid-morning in the library, where Richard was making a largely unsuccessful effort to review the quarterly tobacco accounts. She carried a letter, the kind that arrived with wax seals and good paper, and she set it on the edge of the desk without announcement. "From Ambassador Vasiliev's secretary," she said. "It was addressed to both of us." Richard looked at the letter, then at her. She had already turned to go. "Helen." She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. There was a breath of silence, one beat two, before she turned to face him. And in that pause, he understood that the turning was a choice she was making deliberately, not a reflex. She had learned to make it a choice. He had taught her that without meaning to. "Sit down," he said. "I have the household accounts to, please." The word came out differently than he intended. Not a host's courtesy, but something rawer, less managed. "Please sit down." She sat. Her back was straight, her hands folded in her lap. Her expression, the careful neutral she had perfected over 6 years of dinners and drawing rooms and conversations in which she had been spoken over and passed and around. She looked like a woman prepared to be polite. She did not look like a woman who expected anything. That expression, more than anything that had happened the previous evening, made Richard's chest tighten in a way he didn't know what to do with. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. It came out without a question mark, which was not what he intended, but it was honest. "Tell you what, specifically?" "About the Baltic routes, the Archangel analysis, the merchant correspondence." He picked up a pen and put it back down. "Any of it." Helen looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that measures something. "I did tell you," she said finally. 3 years ago, I came to you with a letter from a Riga merchant who was proposing a new freight arrangement. I told you the terms were disadvantageous and that I believed there was a better route available through the northern corridor." He searched his memory, found nothing. "I don't remember that conversation." "I know you don't." Her voice was even, not accusing something quieter than that which was somehow worse. "You were reading the Hargrove correspondence at the time. You told me you'd look at it later. You never did. You should have pressed me." "I tried, Richard, twice more." A pause that had weight. "The third time you told me that trade routes were not something I needed to concern myself with. You said it kindly. You meant it kindly. But the meaning was the same." He had no answer to that. "So I stopped telling you," she said, "and I kept reading." The letter from Vasiliev's secretary sat on the corner of the desk between them like a third presence in the room. Richard picked it up and broke the seal and read it, and then read it again, because the first reading didn't fully land. The ambassador was requesting a formal meeting. Not with Richard. not with Richard and his associates. The letter named Helen specifically, Mrs. Helen Langford Winthrop, as the party with whom the Russian delegation wished to discuss the possibility of a commercial arrangement regarding Atlantic trading interests. It was written in the courtly but precise language of diplomatic correspondence, and it was entirely unmistakably clear. Richard set the letter back down. "I wants to meet with you," he said. "Yes. To discuss a trade arrangement." "That's what the letter says." He stood up, sat back down. Did the small, agitated choreography of a man whose understanding of a situation is reorganizing itself in real time, and who has not yet decided what to do about it. "Helen, how long have you been?" He stopped, restarted. The analysis that Vasiliev mentioned, the Langford analysis of the Baltic corridor that circulated among the merchant houses. He said he'd read your name in commercial documents. My father included my name in some of the materials when I drafted them for him. A beat. Not always. Sometimes he didn't. But a few of the later analyses, the ones from 1813 and 1814 when his health was declining and I was doing most of the work, those had my name. Your father's health was declining in 1813. Yes. You were running his trading operation. I was helping to run it. Her voice stayed steady. My father was still present. He made the final decisions. But he relied on my analysis, and he trusted my recommendations, and he said so to the people he worked with. She met his eyes. He was not a man who thought his daughter's work was something to be hidden, Richard. He was proud of it. The implication landed without being spoken. Richard heard it anyway. He looked at his wife, truly looked with the particular attention he had not given her in years, and he saw for perhaps the first time the full shape of what she was. Not simply a capable woman who had surprised him. A woman who had been capable all along, working quietly in the margins of a life that gave her no center, developing an expertise that had circulated in international merchant circles, while her husband was down the hall telling her that trade was not her concern. "Why did you marry me?" he said. The question surprised him as much as it surprised her. But it was genuine, and it was urgent, and he needed to know. Helen was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. "My father thought well of your family," she said at last. "He believed you were a man of integrity. He believed you would be fair." She looked at the window. "I was 25. I had spent most of my adult life working in a trading operation that the world considered my father's. I was tired of being invisible in work that was partly mine. I thought—" She stopped. "You thought marriage would be different. I thought a home of my own would give me a place to stand," she said quietly. "I thought a husband who was secure enough in his own standing might be secure enough to let me have mine." And instead. She turned back to him. The neutrality in her expression had shifted not to anger, which would have been easier, but to something more honest than that, something that had given up performing. "Instead, I learned that the kind of man who can let a woman stand beside him, rather than behind him, is rarer than I understood at 25. The room was very quiet. Outside, the summer sounds of the estate went on without them. Horses in the yard, someone calling instructions near the tobacco barn, the particular rhythms of a working property that did not stop because the people inside the house had arrived at a difficult truth. Richard stood up. He walked to the window. I had a view of the east field from here. 200 acres of tobacco in mid-season, the rows straight and the plants thick. He had stood at this window 100 times and felt the particular satisfaction of a man looking at something that belonged to him. It occurred to him now, standing here with his wife's words still in the air behind him, that he had always looked at this view and thought about ownership, about what was his. He had never not once thought about what it cost, not the labor. He understood the labor. He paid for the labor and managed it and thought about it in the careful economic terms of a man who ran a profitable operation. But the other cost, the cost of a life arranged entirely around his decisions, his preferences, his blindnesses. That cost he had never tallied because it wasn't his to pay. Helen paid it. She had been paying it for 6 years. He turned back from the window. "The meeting with Vasiliev," he said. "I would like to attend." Something moved across her face, careful, measured, not quite what he expected. As my husband, he said before she could speak. Not as the principal. I understand the distinction. A pause. That, Helen said, is the most useful thing you have said to me in quite some time. It was not forgiveness. He didn't deserve forgiveness, and they both knew it. But it was something a crack in the careful surface. She maintained a hairline opening that suggested the wall had not yet become permanent. He would take it. He would have to. The meeting with Vasiliev was set for the following Thursday at a private parlor in Charlottesville, where the ambassador was lodging during his extended stay. In the 4 days between, Richard tried to do something he had not done in years, which was pay attention. He ate breakfast in the small dining room off the kitchen, which was where Helen took her morning meal, and the first morning she looked at him with the expression of a woman who has encountered something unexpected in a room she considered her own. She did not ask why he was there. She poured his coffee from the pot on the table and handed it across without comment, and they ate in a silence that was different from the silence they usually shared, not empty, but watchful. Two people who had been strangers in the same house trying to remember how to occupy the same room. The second morning she brought a letter to the table, not the diplomatic kind, but a merchant letter from a house in Baltimore she had apparently been corresponding with for some time. She set it beside her plate and read it while she ate, and Richard watched her face move through the contents. A small frown, a brief consideration, something that resolved into a quiet nod, and he realized he was watching her work. Problem, he said. She looked up. Something flickered surprise, he thought, and then something more guarded behind it. The Harmon House in Baltimore is proposing a modification to their annual timber arrangement, she said. They want to shift the payment structure from quarterly settlement to semi-annual, citing their own cash flow difficulties. But the modification benefits them significantly more than it benefits us, and the terms they're proposing include a penalty clause for early renegotiation that would lock us into the arrangement for 3 additional years. Richard put down his cup. You've been managing the Baltimore timber correspondence. Someone had to. It wasn't accusation. It was statement. Your solicitor, Mr. Crane, handles the legal documentation. But the commercial negotiation, the terms, the counteroffers, the relationship maintenance. Crane is not a merchant, Richard. He knows contracts. He doesn't know trade. And you do. I grew up in a trading house. She folded the letter. I know trade. He sat with that for a moment. What would you do about the Harmon proposal? She looked at him steadily, trying to determine, he supposed, whether the question was genuine or ceremonial. I would write back accepting the semi-annual structure, she said, but declining the penalty clause entirely and replacing it with a mutual early exit provision at 6 months' notice. That gives them the cash flow flexibility they need while protecting our ability to renegotiate if their financial difficulties worsen, which I believe they will. The Harmon House has overextended in the Philadelphia market, and I think in 18 months they will be grateful for an exit they can take gracefully rather than a penalty they cannot afford. He stared at her. How do you know they've overextended in Philadelphia? Because their credit factor in Philadelphia is a man named Whitfield, who was my father's agent for 4 years, and Whitfield writes to me twice a year with an account of what he's seeing in the market. She picked up her coffee cup. I've maintained my father's correspondence network since his death. Most of it. The parts that remained active. Your father's correspondence network, Richard repeated. Yes, which includes commercial agents in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Richmond, Boston, and 3 contacts in London, she said. And as of approximately 4 years ago, an indirect line of communication through a French merchant house in Bordeaux that my mother's family established in the 1780s. The silence that followed was the kind that has a weight to it. Richard had built his commercial operation, the tobacco contracts, the timber arrangements, the shipping relationships through years of personal negotiation and the social network of Virginia's landed gentry. He had done it well. He was not a foolish businessman. He had made money and protected it and grown it with the careful conservatism of a man who understood that what he had was worth protecting. But what he was hearing across the breakfast table in the small dining room he had never once bothered to eat in until 3 days ago was that his wife had a commercial intelligence network that reached into 4 American cities and 2 European countries. He had been telling her to leave business to men. while she ran a shadow operation from the sitting room at the back of the house. "Helen," he said, and his voice came out differently than he intended, rough at the edges, stripped of the easy authority he usually wore. "I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is the one I deserve." She waited. "Did you ever consider," he said, "leaving?" The question sat between them like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward in all directions. Helen set down her coffee cup. She looked at her hands for a moment, just a moment, and then back at him. "Yes," she said. He had expected it, had half known it before he asked, but hearing it still did something to his chest that surprised him with its force. "When?" he said. "The winter of 1814. She said it without hesitation, which meant she had never forgotten it. "Your solicitor Crane came to the house while you were in Charlottesville. He had a contract for the Williams timber boundary, the one you'd been negotiating for 2 months. He needed your signature. You weren't here. He was going to leave and come back the following week, but the signing deadline was 48 hours away." She paused. "I read the contract." "You read a legal contract." "I read the contract," she said again. "And I found a clause in the 3rd section that would have transferred mineral rights on the northern 40 acres to the Williams family in perpetuity, which was not what you had agreed to, and not what you intended, but which had been inserted, I believe, through carelessness rather than malice by the Williams family's attorney. I wrote a note explaining the issue. I gave it to Crane. He took it back to the Williams attorney and had the clause removed before the signing deadline." Richard sat very still. "Crane told me the contract had required a last-minute adjustment," he said slowly. "He said he'd caught an error." "He was being kind," Helen said, "or protecting himself. I'm not sure which." "That was 4 years ago." "Yes." "And that was when you considered leaving." "That was when I understood clearly what the situation was," she said. "I had saved a contract that would have cost you the mineral rights to 40 acres of your best timberland. I had done it by reading carefully and thinking clearly, which is what I do. And I knew sitting in that parlor with Crane's carriage pulling away that you would never know I had done it. That Crane would take the credit, or the error would simply be described as having been caught, and my name would not appear anywhere in the story. Because I had no standing in your business, Richard. Because you had made it very clear that I had no standing." She was not angry. That was what undid him. If she had been angry, he would have known how to respond. He could have defended himself, could have produced reasons and justifications, could have navigated the confrontation with the social facility he'd spent a lifetime developing. But she was not angry. She was clear. There is a particular kind of pain that clarity produces in a guilty person, and Richard felt it then, with a thoroughness that left him no room to maneuver. "But you didn't leave," he said. "No." "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because the house needed managing," she said. "Because there was work to do that mattered. Because—" She stopped, started again. "Because I am not a woman who walks away from something simply because it is difficult. I would have needed a reason that was worse than difficult." A pause. "And because I had not yet—" She stopped again. "Not yet what?" She shook her head slightly. "It doesn't matter now. It matters to me." She looked at him for a long time. "I had not yet given up on the possibility," she said carefully, "that you might eventually look up." He could not speak. She stood, picked up her letter, folded it, tucked it into the pocket of her morning dress with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had long since learned to carry her own correspondence herself. She moved toward the door. "I'll draft the response to Harmon," she said. "You should review it before Crane sends it. It will be better if it comes through proper channels." "Helen." She paused in the doorway. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for last night specifically. For all of it. For the years of it." She turned to look at him. The expression on her face was complicated, not cold, not warm, but somewhere in the middle where things are real rather than performed. "I know," she said, and she walked out. He sat at the breakfast table in the small dining room for a long time after she left, surrounded by cooling coffee and the morning sounds of the estate and the full, unglamorous weight of what he had done and left undone for 6 years. He thought about the winter of 1814. Helen alone in the parlor with a contract she wasn't supposed to be reading. Finding the error that Crane had missed writing the note that had saved his timber rights, and then sitting with the silence of it, unnamed, uncredited, unasked. He thought about all the other silences he had never looked into. I thought about Clara, not with longing, not anymore, but with a clarity that was uncomfortable in its own right. Clara had told him what he wanted to hear, had reflected him back at his most flattering angle, had required of him only what he was already prepared to give. He had called that understanding. He understood now that it was simply the absence of challenge. Clara had not seen him clearly either. She had seen the version of him he chose to perform, and she had performed appreciation in return, and between them they had created something that felt in the moment like intimacy, and was actually just two mirrors pointed at each other. Helen had seen him. The real version. The one that didn't bother to listen. The one that assumed. The one that told his wife to leave business to men, while she quietly kept his business from hemorrhaging 40 acres of mineral rights. She had seen him and stayed anyway. He owed her more than an apology. I was going to have to figure out what exactly that looked like. And it was going to take longer than a breakfast conversation. He knew that. He was not a naive man, and he was not going to insult her by imagining that 3 days of changed behavior would undo 6 years of the other kind. But he had to believe this, because the alternative was unbearable, not beyond repair. He had been careless with something rare, but careless was not the same as corrupt. There was a difference between a man who had failed to see what was in front of him and a man who had seen it and chosen otherwise. I was not sure, sitting in the morning quiet of the small dining room, that Helen believed that distinction mattered. He was going to have to show her that it did. He picked up her empty coffee cup. She had left it on the table, rather than carry it to the kitchen. A small, unconscious abandonment of the habits of a woman who had spent 6 years managing every domestic detail in a house that was technically hers, and he carried it to the kitchen himself. It was a small thing. I knew it was a small thing, but it was the first thing he'd done in 6 years that cost him nothing and was done entirely for her. And it felt in the cramped and ordinary kitchen of the house he had built to be magnificent, like the beginning of something he did not yet have a name for. Outside, the tobacco fields were green and patient under the Virginia summer sun. They did not know anything about what had happened inside. They simply went on growing. So did the morning. And in the back sitting room behind a closed door, Helen Langford Winthrop sat at her writing desk and drafted a letter to the Harmon House in Baltimore. Clear, precise, commercially shrewd. That would, she estimated, save the Winthrop timber interests somewhere in the region of £400 sterling over the next 3 years. She did not tell Richard she estimated that. Not yet. But she wrote it down in the margin of her draft in her careful hand. Some habits she thought were worth keeping. And some numbers she thought were worth knowing. Even if the knowing had been hers alone for longer than it should have been. The parlor at the Charlottesville Inn, where Ambassador Vassiliev had taken his lodgings, was not a grand room, but it had been arranged with the particular intentionality of a man who understood that the setting of a conversation shapes its outcome. A table had been cleared and reset. Documents were stacked in precise order on the sideboard. The secretary, a young man named Fedorov, whose English was excellent and whose habit of watching everything without appearing to watch anything, marked him as considerably more than an administrative assistant, had arranged 3 chairs on one side of the table and 2 on the other. 2 on the other. Richard noticed it before he sat down. The ambassador had structured this meeting as though Helen was bringing a colleague, not attending as a wife. I took the second chair without comment. Helen settled into the first, placed her leather document case on the table with a quiet authority that Richard had never seen from her in a social setting, and recognized immediately as belonging to a woman returning to a context where she had always known exactly who she was. Her back was straight. Her hands were still. She was wearing a dress of dark green wool, not the elaborate evening wear of the dinner, but the composed professional dress of a woman who understood that today was not about being looked at. Vassiliev entered with Fedorov at his shoulder, and one additional man Richard hadn't seen before. Older, heavyset, with the weathered look of someone who had spent considerable time at sea or near it. He was introduced as Korolev, a senior factor in the ambassador's trading interests. The introduction of Korolev changed the weight of the room. This was not a courtesy meeting. This was not a diplomat indulging a curiosity. This was a commercial evaluation, and Korolev was here to assess. Vasiliev settled into his chair, accepted a cup of tea from Fedorov, and looked at Helen across the table. "Mrs. Winthrop," he said, "I have spent the past 4 days making inquiries." Helen waited. The Langford analysis of 1813. The one I mentioned at dinner was distributed among 6 merchant houses in the Baltic trading network. It was well regarded. It identified a weakness in the Riga corridor arrangement that several of those houses subsequently acted upon. He set down his tea. At the time, it was attributed to a Mr. H. Langford. Most people assumed the H stood for Harold, which was your father's Christian name. "My father's name was Henry," Helen said. "Mine is Helen. We shared the initial." "Yes." A pause. "I have now confirmed that the 1813 analysis and the 1814 follow-up assessment of the Archangel route modification were both drafted primarily by you." Korolev across the table had not moved. He was watching Helen with the focused assessment of a man determining the value of something. "Who confirmed it?" Helen asked. "A merchant in Boston named Whitfield," Vasiliev said, "who told me that he has been in correspondence with you since your father's death, and that in his professional estimation, the quality of commercial analysis he receives from you has not declined since you took over the correspondence independently." Whitfield. Richard turned the name over in his mind and found it the Philadelphia credit factor Helen had mentioned at breakfast, who wrote to her twice a year, who had been her father's agent, who had apparently also been speaking to Russian ambassadors about her abilities. Helen's expression did not change. "Mr. Whitfield is generous," she said. "Mr. Whitfield is precise," Vasiliev corrected. "He is not a generous man by reputation. He is a careful one." He opened the folder in front of him. "I want to show you something, Mrs. Winthrop." He slid a document across the table. Helen picked it up. "Read it." Richard watched her face as she read the small movements of concentration, the slight tightening around her eyes, that meant she had found something that needed to be considered carefully. He was learning to read her 3 days in, and what he was learning was that the surface stillness he had always mistaken for emptiness was in fact the outward expression of an interior that never stopped moving. "This is a proposed freight arrangement," she said, "between the Russian trading house and an American merchant cooperative." "A draft proposal," Vasiliev said, "drawn up by my commercial advisors in Petersburg. I have been carrying it for 2 months, showing it to various parties in America, whose opinion I value, attempting to determine whether the structure is sound." Korolev leaned forward for the first time. "We have shown it to 11 parties," he said. His English carried a heavier accent than Vasiliev's but was equally precise. 8 of them told us it was excellent. 3 told us it had problems. Of the 3, 2 identified the same problem. 1 identified a different problem." He paused. "We believe the 1 was correct and the 2 were wrong." Helen set the document down. "The routing clause in Section 4 is the problem the 2 identified," she said. "They're right that it's awkward, but it's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is the settlement currency provision in Section 7. If prices shift, and they will shift because they always do, the provision, as written, exposes the American side to exchange losses that the Russian side is fully insulated from. It looks symmetrical on paper. It isn't." Complete silence. Korolev sat back. He looked at Vasiliev. Something passed between them. Not surprise exactly, but the satisfaction of a particular kind of confirmation. "You are the one," Korolev said. Helen looked at him. "We have been trying to identify the author of the 1814 Archangel assessment for 3 years," he said. There is no other word exceptional. It identified a structural correction in the northern route that our own analysts missed, that we implemented at considerable benefit, and the name attached to it was H. Langford, who died in 1815, which we knew, which made the authorship." He stopped. "We thought perhaps it was a junior analyst in his firm. We thought perhaps it was Whitfield. We could not locate the source." Helen was quiet for a moment. "I wrote it in 6 weeks," she said. "In the evenings. I had access to my father's complete correspondence archive, and I had been studying the route assessments for 2 years before that." A pause. I was 27 years old. Korolev made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite an exclamation. The sound of a man recalibrating a significant assumption. Richard had not said a word since sitting down. He was not sure he was capable of words. He was sitting in a chair he had occupied as a courtesy, as Helen's husband, not as the principal as he had said. And what he was discovering was that his presence was genuinely incidental to everything happening in this room. Not dismissively, not humiliatingly, simply factually. The conversation did not need him. The meeting did not require him. The 2 decades of commercial experience, the timber contracts, the tobacco arrangements, the social standing he had carefully maintained in Virginia's gentry networks, none of it was relevant to what was unfolding 3 feet away from him. His wife was the most important person in this room. He had been married to her for 6 years, and this was the first time he had understood that clearly. Vasiliev leaned forward and placed a second document beside the first. "We have a proposition," he said. "It is direct. I will not dress it in diplomatic language because I believe you will prefer precision." He looked at Helen steadily. "We wish to engage you as a commercial analyst and advisor for the Russian trading house's American operations. The arrangement would be formal, compensated, contracted with your name attached to your work rather than anyone else's. The initial engagement would be 1 year with the expectation that it would continue if the working relationship is satisfactory, which I expect it will be." The room held its breath. Helen looked at the second document. She looked at it for a long time, and Richard could see her reading it, could see the quality of attention she brought to the page. Not the polite, performative attention of a woman in a social setting, but the genuine, consuming attention of a professional encountering something that mattered. "The compensation structure," she said. "It's commission based on recommendations implemented." "Yes. That means my income is tied to outcomes, not to effort." "Yes." Vasiliev's expression was level. "We believe that aligns our interests correctly. You profit when we profit from your advice. And if a recommendation is sound, but not implemented, due to political considerations, or internal resistance, or simple institutional inertia, I bear the cost of that." Korolev made a small sound of appreciation. "The standard objection," he said, "raised by every experienced analyst who has ever reviewed a commission structure." "Because it is a legitimate objection," Helen said. "It is." Vasiliev nodded. "We are prepared to negotiate the structure. We are not committed to commission only if you can propose an alternative that satisfies both parties." Helen set the document down. She looked at Richard. It was the first time she had looked directly at him since they sat down, and the look was not asking permission. He understood that immediately, and was grateful for the understanding because the alternative would have been unbearable. She was not asking permission. She was giving him the courtesy of acknowledgement, the minimal dignity of being seen in the room where he sat. He gave her a single small nod. She turned back to Vasiliev. "I will review the full contract," she said. "I will want my own solicitor to review it as well, not my husband's my own, which I will engage independently. If the terms are satisfactory after that review, I am prepared to discuss an arrangement." Fedorov was already writing. The meeting lasted another hour. Helen and Vasiliev moved through the terms with the focused efficiency of 2 professionals who respected each other's time, and Richard sat in his chair and watched his wife negotiate, not the soft, accommodating negotiation of someone trying to please, but the direct, precise negotiation of someone who knows the value of what she is offering and is not prepared to take less than it is worth. She knew what she was worth. She had always known. She had simply been living in a house where no one else did. When the meeting concluded and the documents were set aside for the review process, Vasiliev stood and shook Helen's hand. Not the social hand clasp of a dinner party, but the firm, deliberate handshake of a commercial agreement that is already in all the ways that matter settled. He turned to Richard with the courtesy of a man who understands that social forms must be maintained even when they are not particularly relevant. "Mr. Winthrop." A nod. "You are fortunate." Richard met the older man's eyes. "I know," he said. "I am beginning to understand precisely how fortunate." Vasiliev studied him for a moment. Not unkindly, but the assessment was genuine. "Good," he said simply, and moved toward the door. In the carriage, back to the estate. Richard and Helen sat across from each other on the narrow bench seats, and the wheels turned on the Virginia road, and neither of them spoke for long enough that the silence became its own kind of conversation. Richard was working through something, and Helen could see it, the careful, effortful working of a man, dismantling a version of reality he had built over years, and trying to determine what comes next when the structure comes down. "Korolev," Richard said finally. He said they'd been trying to identify the author of the 1814 assessment for 3 years. "Yes." "They implemented your recommendation." "They did." "Without knowing who wrote it." "Without knowing who wrote it," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "How much did it benefit them?" he asked. "I don't know their specific figures," she said. "But if the Archangel Corridor performed for their operation, the way it performed for my father's, and the scale of the Russian trading house is considerably larger than my father's ever was, the benefit would have been substantial." "Substantial," he repeated. "Richard." Her voice was patient but clear. "You are trying to calculate what my work is worth in terms you're accustomed to. I understand that. But the number is large enough that the calculation will be uncomfortable, so I would suggest you simply accept that it is large and move forward from there." He looked at her. She was not unkind about it. She never was. But she was direct, and the directness he was realizing was not a recent development. She had always been direct precisely and consistently, and he had simply never listened carefully enough to notice. The carriage hit a rut. They both braced against the seats. And in that small, ordinary moment of shared physical adjustment, something shifted slightly between them. An involuntary movement toward each other, and then the conscious choice of whether to move back. Neither of them moved back. It was a small thing. Richard noticed it anyway. They were back at the estate by late afternoon, and the household had the settled rhythm of a working property in the middle of its day. The steward was in the yard. The kitchen was producing something that smelled of roasting meat and summer herbs. 2 of the field managers were waiting near the barn with a question about the eastern boundary drainage that Richard had been putting off for a week. He dealt with the managers, walking the boundary question, making a decision about the drainage channel that he had been avoiding because it required capital expenditure. He'd been reluctant to authorize, and when he came back inside, he found Helen in the library, not the sitting room. She was at his desk. He stopped in the doorway. She was reading the Harmon correspondence, the letter she had mentioned at breakfast, the Baltimore timber arrangement, the problematic penalty clause. She had the draft response she'd written beside it, and she was making small notations in the margin with a pen she had taken from his desk's pen stand. And she looked up when he appeared in the doorway, with the neutral expression of a woman who is deciding whether to apologize for using someone's space. "I needed the better light," she said. "It's your house," he said. She held the pen still for a moment. "It's your desk," she said. "Use it." He crossed to the chair opposite. "Show me the Harmon draft." She turned the pages toward him. He read it. He read it carefully, the way she had been reading things carefully his entire life, while he moved quickly past the surface. The letter was precise and commercially astute, and had the particular quality of a document written by someone who understood both the law and the trade, which was rarer than people assumed, because lawyers understood documents and merchants understood commerce. But the space where those two things overlapped required a different kind of mind entirely. "This is better than anything Crane has drafted for me in 5 years, he said. "Crane is a good solicitor," Helen said. "He's not a commercial thinker." "No." Richard set the letter down. "He's not." A pause. "You should have been signing these yourself from the beginning." The silence that followed was not empty. Helen looked at him steadily, and he could see the thing moving behind her eyes, the careful, controlled calculation of a woman deciding how much truth the moment could hold. "The law does not permit a married woman to enter commercial contracts independently," she said. "You know that." "I know it." He met her eyes. "Which means the Vasiliev arrangement will need to be structured through me legally. My name on the contract." "Yes." "While the work is yours." "As it has always been," she said quietly. He sat with that. It was not new information. He had known the legal reality before they walked into the Charlottesville parlor. But hearing it stated plainly, as it has always been made, the full architecture of the situation, visible in a way that the abstract knowledge hadn't. Her work circulating in merchant houses across 3 countries. Her name on documents she had signed H. Langford. Her analysis implemented by Russian trading operations. All of it technically and legally filtered through the name of a man first, her father, now her husband, while she existed in the official record as a wife who preferred quiet matters. He had said that, at his own dinner table, in front of 20 people, she prefers quiet matters. "I will sign whatever the Vasiliev arrangement requires," he said. "And when I sign it, I will make clear to Vasiliev, to Korolev, to anyone else involved, that the work is yours and the credit is yours. Whatever the law requires my name to appear on, the people in the room will know who they are actually engaging." Helen was very still. "Richard, I mean it." He said it quietly without drama, because the moment did not need drama, it needed to be real, and he knew the difference between performing sincerity and actually meaning something. "I have cost you enough already. I am not going to cost you this." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is—" She stopped, restarted. "That is more than I expected. I know." He leaned forward, his elbows on the edge of his own desk, in the chair that had always been his, and the room that had always been his, and the house that had always been his, and he felt fully, and without the comfort of any excuse, the immense and ordinary weight of having had everything and noticed almost none of it. "I know it is, and I know it doesn't fix what I've already done. But it's what I have to offer right now, and I'm offering it." The late afternoon moved through the library around them. The light shifted. Somewhere in the east field, someone was calling instructions, the daily sounds of the estate going about its business. Helen set down the pen. She folded her hands on the desk in front of her, and she looked at her husband with an expression that was complex and real, and not performing anything. "I will need to think," she said, "about the Vasiliev arrangement. About everything." He nodded. He did not push. He understood more clearly now than he had understood anything in recent memory that the relationship between them was not a thing he could fix unilaterally any more than a merchant house can repair a contract simply by wanting to. It required 2 parties. It required time. It required the kind of sustained attention that he had failed to give for 6 years, and which could not be retroactively applied in a single conversation, however honest. He stood. "Take the desk," he said. "For as long as you need it." He walked toward the door. "Richard." He turned. She was looking at him with the level, unguarded expression he had been catching more frequently in these 3 days, the one that existed beneath the careful neutral, the one that was real rather than managed. "The drainage decision you made this afternoon," she said. "About the Eastern Channel. $200 in capital outlay." He stilled. "You heard that." The window was open. The faintest trace of something moved across her face, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "It's the right decision. You should have made it 6 months ago, but the spring planting would have been disrupted. Now is the correct time." A pause. "The Eastern field tobacco yield has been running 3% below potential for 2 seasons because the drainage is wrong. Fix the channel, and by next year, you'll recover the $200 and then some." He stared at her. She turned back to the Harmon letter. He stood in the doorway of his library, looking at his wife, reading his correspondence at his desk, and he thought about all the tobacco yields she had watched underperform for reasons she could identify and he had never asked. All the decisions she had seen being made incorrectly, at which she had looked and said nothing. Not because she didn't know better, but because she had learned he had taught her that her knowing better was not welcome. I thought about 6 years of answers to questions he had never asked. He walked out of the library and closed the door gently behind him, giving her the room and the desk and the light, and he went to find his steward to confirm the drainage decision and authorize the expenditure. And on the way, he passed the front hall, where 4 days ago Helen had walked up the stairs with her candle while he stood in the dark, and he understood something he had not understood then. She had not been walking away from him. She had been walking toward the room where her work was. The sitting room at the back of the house. The writing desk with the correspondence. The letters from Whitfield and the Bordeaux merchant contacts, and the careful, sustained private labor of a mind that had never stopped working just because no one was asking it to. She had been walking toward herself, and he had been the one standing in the dark. That evening, two things happened that Richard had not anticipated. The first was that Margaret Forsyth, the woman from the dinner party who had found her soup so interesting, at the moment of the hand-holding, arrived at the estate with a social call that lasted 40 minutes, a very clear and pointed communication. What had happened at the dinner was known, had been discussed, and Virginia's gentry networks had arrived at a collective opinion that was not favorable to Richard and was not unfavorable to Helen. Margaret Forsyth did not say this directly. She was a woman who had been raised in a world where directness was considered coarse, and she had long since mastered the art of saying the necessary thing through the thing she appeared to be saying. What she appeared to be saying was that she had found the ambassador's visit to the county very interesting, and that Helen must be so pleased to have such distinguished visitors, and that it was remarkable how much talent some women kept quietly to themselves. Wasn't it? And that she would love to have Helen to tea next Thursday if Helen's schedule permitted. The invitation was extended to Helen, not to Richard, after Margaret Forsyth's carriage left. Richard stood in the front hall and understood that the social consequence of the dinner, which he had managed in the bustle of the past 4 days to partially set aside in favor of the more immediate domestic reckoning, had not been set aside by anyone else. Virginia did not forget. It simply waited with the patient courtesy of a place that understood that everything surfaced eventually, and then it made its opinion known through the precise instrument of who was invited to tea and who was not. The second thing that happened was a letter from Clara. It arrived in the late afternoon post, addressed to Richard in Clara's careful hand, and he took it to his study and closed the door. It was short. Clara was not a woman who labored over words when she had made a decision. She wrote that she understood the situation had changed, that she was returning to Richmond within the fortnight, that she wished him well. She wrote it with the grace of a woman who had not gotten what she wanted, but who understood the landscape well enough to withdraw before the terrain became any more difficult. She said one other thing. At the end of the letter in the last paragraph, she wrote, "I believe I was a mirror when you needed a window, and for that, I am also partly responsible." Richard read that sentence 3 times. It was the most perceptive thing Clara had ever said to him, which meant she had understood the situation more clearly than she had ever indicated while they were in it. He wasn't sure whether to be grateful for the honesty or troubled by the timing. He set the letter in the fire, not from guilt, but from the same instinct that makes a man clear a table before he builds something new on it. And he watched it burn, and he thought about mirrors and windows, and the particular blindness of a man who had surrounded himself with reflections for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to see through to something real. How was tired of mirrors. He wanted the window. He went to find his wife. She was in the sitting room at the back of the house, the room she had always used in the evenings, the room where she had spent 3 years reading merchant correspondence and writing analyses that circulated in Baltic trading houses. She was at her desk, and when Richard knocked on the open door, she looked up without the composed neutrality she'd been wearing for days. Just looked up, unguarded for a moment. "I want to propose something," he said. She waited. "Next Thursday, when you go to Forsyth's tea." He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her desk, the chair that had always been there, that he had never sat in before, not once in 6 years. "I'd like to spend the morning reviewing the estate accounts together. Not with Crane, without Crane, you and I." She was still. "All of them," he said. "The tobacco contracts, the Baltimore timber, the shipping arrangements, everything." He held her gaze. "I want to know what you know, and I want to know where we've been losing money. We didn't need to lose, and how long it's been happening, and what to do about it." The silence between them was different from the silences that had come before. Those had been full of things unsaid. This one was full of something else. The particular tension of two people standing at the edge of something new. Neither of them entirely sure of the ground beneath their feet, but both of them still standing. "Everything," she said. "Everything." She turned back to the letter she had been writing. She finished the sentence she was on. He watched her write it, the careful, deliberate strokes of a woman who took precision seriously, and then she set the pen down and folded her hands and looked at him. "Thursday morning then," she said. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was not the resolution of 6 years of accumulated wrong in a single week of changed behavior. He knew that, and she knew that, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But it was something real. And something real built on honest ground was worth more than anything built on the comfortable fictions he had been living inside for years. He stood. He left her to her letter, walking back through the house. He passed the dining room, where 5 days ago he had held Clara's hand at his own dinner table, and believed himself in that moment to be a free man, making a free choice. He understood now what he had actually been. He had been a man who confused freedom with inattention and choice with the absence of consequence, and had lived inside that confusion for long enough that it had become the furniture of his life. The shape he moved around without noticing that he only saw clearly when someone walked through his door and bowed to his wife. The real question was what he did with the seeing. That was still being determined. By both of them. Thursday morning arrived with the particular clarity of a Virginia summer that has decided briefly to behave itself. Richard was at the library desk before Helen came downstairs, which was unusual enough that when she appeared in the doorway and found him already there, the estate ledgers pulled from the shelf, the tobacco contract files stacked in the order. She would have stacked them a fresh pot of coffee on the side table. She stopped walking. She looked at the arrangement. She looked at him. "You found the secondary ledger," she said. "Second shelf behind the surveying records." He pulled out her chair, the one across from the desk, the one he had sat in 5 days ago for the first time. Crane files things in a way that seems designed to discourage anyone from looking at them too carefully. Helen sat. She accepted the coffee he poured without comment, which meant she was choosing not to make an observation she had clearly formed. He was learning to read these silences, the ones that held a complete thought she was deciding not to voice. He was beginning to understand that there were years' worth of them stacked up like documents in a badly organized filing system. "Where do you want to start?" he asked. She opened the secondary ledger to a page she had clearly opened before the binding fell naturally to that spot, the particular looseness of paper that has been returned to many times. She turned it toward him and set her finger on a column of figures. "Here," she said. "The shipping costs for the tobacco consignments. Last 3 years." He looked at the column. Then he looked harder. "These figures are wrong," he said. "No." Her voice was entirely level. "They are exactly what was paid." He looked at the numbers again and did the arithmetic in his head, which was one of the things he did well and had always done quickly. The freight rate per hogshead was running 22% above the standard Baltimore rate he'd been quoted when he negotiated the original shipping arrangement. 22%. Over 3 years. On a tobacco operation of his volume. "How much?" he said. He already knew it was going to be a number that hurt. Over 3 years, accounting for the variation in annual yield, somewhere between 800 and 900 pounds sterling in excess freight charges. She took a sip of coffee. Above what the market rate would have been if the arrangement had been renegotiated in 1815, when the freight market shifted significantly in favor of the shipper. He was quiet. "I noticed it in the autumn of 1815, Helen said. "I wrote a note to Crane asking whether the shipping contract had been reviewed since the original arrangement." She paused. He wrote back that the arrangement was satisfactory, and that the existing relationship with the shipping house was valuable for reasons beyond the pure freight cost. "He didn't tell me." "No," she said. "He didn't." Richard sat with 800 pounds of excess freight charges and the particular nausea of a man discovering that the people he trusted to manage his interests had been managing their own instead. Crane had a relationship with the shipping house. That relationship clearly had value to Crane. The question of what it cost Richard was apparently not something Crane had felt compelled to raise. "Why didn't you come to me directly?" he asked, "when Crane brushed you off?" The look she gave him was not unkind. He heard the question land the way she heard it, and he understood immediately how it sounded. The same man who had told her to leave business to men asking why she hadn't pushed harder when the business was bleeding. "You're right," he said before she could answer. "Never mind. I understand why." She nodded once, turned to the next page. They worked for 3 hours. What emerged from those 3 hours was a picture Richard had not known existed, and could not have assembled himself, because it required both the legal knowledge to read the contracts and the commercial instinct to understand what the numbers meant in the context of actual trade conditions. And Richard had the legal knowledge and the commercial instinct, but not the patient systematic habit of actually looking at the two together. Helen had all three. By the time they reached the Baltimore timber arrangement, the Harmon letter, she had already drafted a response to the problematic penalty clause. The semi-annual payment structure. Richard had stopped trying to hide his reactions. He sat across from his wife and watched her move through 6 years of his financial life, with the confident ease of a woman who had been watching it quietly for years. And what he felt was not the ego-bruising shame of a man being shown his own mistakes. That would have been simpler. What he felt was something more complicated, a grief almost for everything the two of them might have built if he had been different. If he had asked. If he had listened. The tobacco contracts alone. The shipping correction she had identified in 1815 and been unable to implement because Crane controlled the solicitor relationship, and Crane had his own reasons for maintaining the status quo. The Harmon timber arrangement, with its exploitative penalty clause, that would have locked him into a deteriorating relationship for 3 additional years. A smaller issue with the seasonal labor contracts and overlap in the payment periods that had been generating a redundant expense for 2 planting seasons running, which she had caught but had no mechanism to correct. All of it sitting quietly in the secondary ledger in the records she maintained, and Crane never touched, patient and invisible and waiting to be seen. Total correctable loss, Richard said, across everything you've identified. She had already done the calculation. He could tell by the lack of hesitation. Conservative estimate £1,100 over 3 years, she said. Optimistic estimate closer to 1,400, if the Archangel route adjustment we discussed with Vasiliev performs the way I expect it to. He let out a slow breath. £1,400. Enough to rebuild the East Wing. Enough to clear the remaining debt on the Philadelphia equipment loan he'd been servicing for 4 years. Enough to make the Eastern Drainage Improvement and 6 others like it without a moment's hesitation. Helen. He said her name, and then found he wasn't sure what to put after it. She waited. What would it have looked like, he said carefully, if I had listened to you 3 years ago, when you first brought the Riga merchant's letter to me? She was quiet for a moment. Different, she said. Considerably different. Specifically. She looked at the window, not avoiding the question. He had learned the difference, but assembling an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. The shipping arrangement would have been renegotiated in 1815. We save £800 to £900. The Harmon timber arrangement never reaches its current form because I catch the penalty clause before it's executed, and we negotiate differently from the beginning. The Eastern field drainage is corrected in 1816 rather than now, which means the yield differential is recovered a year earlier. She turned back to him. And the Vasiliev connection that comes 3 years sooner, because if you had known in 1814 what I was doing with the Baltic correspondence, we might have had the social standing to arrange an introduction through the Richmond networks by 1815 at the latest. 3 years. 3 years of the Vasiliev commercial relationship beginning in 1815. He did not try to calculate what that was worth. I'm sorry, he said. She had heard him say it before. He understood that, and he understood that repeated apology without changed behavior was the cheapest currency in the world, worth less than nothing, because it cost the speaker nothing and gave the recipient nothing of use. He was not going to make the mistake of believing that saying it again added to its value. I know you are, she said. And then after a pause, I believe you. Those 4 words landed differently than everything else. Not because they resolved anything they didn't, and she wasn't offering them as resolution, and he was grateful enough for her honesty not to mistake them for more than they were. But they were real. They were her real opinion offered without diplomacy or social management. She believed him. It was somewhere to stand. He closed the ledger. I want to make a change in how the accounts are managed, he said. Starting now. Not through Crane. I'll keep Crane for the legal documentation, but the commercial review, the contract assessments, the correspondence with the trading houses. That runs through you. Formally. I'll write to Crane this week and make the arrangement clear. She studied him. Crane will object, she said. Crane works for me. A pause. For us. Something shifted in her expression at the word. The small, involuntary movement of a woman hearing something she had not expected and not yet decided what to do with. There will be men, she said carefully, in our social and commercial circles who find the arrangement irregular. There will be, he agreed. Some of them will say so. Let them. He said it without bluster, quietly, as a statement of position rather than a performance of confidence. I would rather be thought irregular by men who are wrong than continue losing money because I was too proud to admit that my wife understands commerce better than my solicitor. A beat of silence. That is an extraordinarily practical way of arriving at the correct position, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite humor, but was the closest neighbor to it. He felt for the first time in a very long time something that might have been hope. The tea at Margaret Forsyth's that afternoon turned out to be a more significant event than Richard had anticipated, though he was not there to witness it directly. He received the account of it from two sources, from Helen briefly when she returned, and from Pendleton, who had heard it from his daughter, who had heard it from the Forsyth house's cook, which was the Virginia transmission route for the most accurate social information available. There were 8 women at the tea. Helen was the last to arrive, which was not an accident. Margaret Forsyth had arranged the room so that Helen would enter when everyone else was already seated, which meant that every woman in the room could observe the arrival of a woman whose stock had risen sharply in Virginia's social accounting over the past 5 days. What Forsyth had not anticipated was that Anne Caldwell, whose daughter's fever had kept her from the original dinner, had heard the full account from 3 separate sources and arrived at the tea in a state of barely suppressed excitement that she directed entirely at Helen. You must tell us everything, Anne Caldwell said, while Helen was still removing her gloves. About the ambassador, about the conversation at dinner, about the arrangement, because yes, we have all heard there is an arrangement. The room was very attentive. Helen sat. Ambassador Vasiliev was very kind, she said with the composed understatement of a woman who had learned to manage how much information she released into Virginia's social atmosphere at any given moment. The room waited for more. The conversation at dinner concerned Baltic trade routes, she said. I happen to have some familiarity with the subject through my father's commercial work. The ambassador was generous in his attention. Helen Winthrop, Anne Caldwell said, leaning forward with the directness of an old friendship that predated Helen's marriage. I have known you since we were girls, and I know perfectly well when you are telling the truth slowly. Tell it quickly. The room held its breath. Helen looked at Anne at the bright, genuine interest of a woman who had been her friend before she became anyone's wife, who had watched the past 6 years with the quiet concern of a person who cannot intervene and knows it. Something in her expression shifted. The careful management relaxed slightly. Just enough. The ambassador has proposed a commercial arrangement, Helen said. A formal one, with my name attached. The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then all 8 women spoke at once. The account that reached Richard through Pendleton and his daughter was that Helen had accepted the congratulations with characteristic composure, deflected the more intrusive questions about the specific commercial terms with characteristic precision, and had only once briefly said something that stopped the room, and that Pendleton's daughter, who had it from the cook, reported verbatim. What Helen said was, I have spent 6 years being invisible in work that was partly mine. I intend for that to be a chapter that is finished. Richard heard this account in his study at 6 o'clock in the evening. Pendleton's man had delivered it somewhat circuitously through a note from Pendleton that contained 3 lines of elderly social observation, and then this specific quotation underlined. He read the underlined sentence twice. He did not feel defensive. He had earned that sentence, every word of it, and the fact that it had been said among women rather than to his face did not make it less true or less his to carry. What he felt reading it in the evening quiet of his study was a kind of gratitude for the clarity. She had said it. She had named it. And the naming was not an attack. It was a statement of intention. The chapter is finished. She was telling him, through the particular telegraph of Virginia social communication, what she needed the next chapter to look like. He put the note in his desk drawer and went to find her. She was in the library. Her library now, as far as Richard was concerned. Whatever the legal documentation said with the Vasiliev contract draft, spread across the desk, and a second document beside it that he recognized when he came close enough as the framework of a proposed counteroffer. She had been working since she got home. "You told them," he said. She looked up. "Anne Caldwell would have had it out of me eventually," she said. "Better to say it clearly than to have it extracted. You said the invisible chapter was finished." A pause. She set down the pen. "Yes," she said. "I did." "Good." He sat across from her. "I agree with you." She watched him. "I wrote to Crane this afternoon," he said. "I told him the commercial correspondence and contract assessments would be handled directly through the household going forward. I told him your judgment on commercial matters was to be treated as equivalent to mine in all dealings with external parties." He paused. "He wrote back within the hour, which tells me he'd been expecting it." "What did he say?" "He said he understood that he remained available for legal documentation and that he hoped the arrangement would serve the estate well." Richard's expression was dry. He was very composed about it. "He'll tell people." "He already has, probably. He has lunch every Thursday with Forsyth's husband." He met her eyes. "By tomorrow morning, what happened at the tea and what I wrote to Crane will be one story, not two. Virginia will have everything it needs to form a complete picture." Something moved across Helen's face. The complicated, unguarded thing that appeared now more frequently, and that he was beginning to understand, was simply her actual expression, the one she wore when she had stopped performing composure and was simply being herself. "Are you ready for that?" she asked. "Socially." "Are you asking me whether I care what people say?" "I'm asking whether you've thought about what they'll say specifically," she said. "Not the sympathy you'll get sympathy from the men who think you've been very gracious about a difficult situation. I mean the other kind. The men who think a husband who allows his wife to conduct commercial business is either weak or managed." He looked at her steadily. "Let me tell you what I think about those men," he said. "I think they are running their estates with the same quality of commercial oversight I was running mine 5 days ago, which means they are losing money. They don't know they're losing to solicitors and shipping houses and timber merchants who have correctly identified them as men who can be managed because they are too proud to admit they don't know everything." A beat. "I would rather be thought weak by those men than be them." She held his gaze for a long moment. "That," she said quietly, "is the most honest thing you have said to me in 6 years." He did not flinch from it. He had learned in the past week that flinching from her honesty was a way of refusing it, and refusing it was what had created the distance between them in the first place. "I have a great deal of ground to cover," he said. "I understand that. I'm not asking you to pretend I've covered it." "I know, but I want to cover it." He leaned forward. "Not for the estate, not for Vasiliev, for you. Because you have been—" He stopped, started again. "Because what you have done in this house and in this marriage deserves to be seen by the person who should have seen it from the beginning. And I have been that person, and I have failed at it consistently, and I am not interested in failing at it anymore." The room was very still. Outside, the estate went about its evening business. The horses were being settled. The kitchen was finishing the night's work. The field managers had gone home. All the ordinary machinery of a working property moving through its quiet closing hours, indifferent to what was happening inside. Helen looked at her husband, the man she had married at 25, with the hope that he would be someone who could let her stand beside him, and who had spent 6 years being something smaller than that, and who was sitting across from her now, with the naked, uncomfortable, genuine expression of a man who has run out of comfortable distances to maintain. "I don't know," she said, "what this looks like yet. The two of us, going forward." "Neither do I," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it's settled simply because you've had a difficult week. I know. And I am not going to make it easy for you," she said, "by being grateful for the minimum. What you're offering the desk, the correspondence, the Crane arrangement Vasiliev, that is the floor, not the ceiling." He received that without protest. "I understand," he said. She studied him for another long moment. The assessment was real, and he let it be real, made no move to manage it or soften it or redirect it. just sat under it with the full uncomfortable exposure of a man who has decided that being honestly seen is better than being carefully hidden. "All right," she said finally. 2 words, carefully chosen. Not forgiveness. She had told him she was not ready for that, and he was not going to ask for it before she was ready to give it. Not a declaration, but not a door closed either. "All right." He picked up the Vasiliev counteroffer she'd been drafting. "Walk me through this," he said. "The counteroffer. I want to understand your reasoning on the settlement currency clause." She looked at the document in his hands, then at him, and she began to talk. She talked the way she had talked to Vasiliev at the dinner, without performance, without management, with the full clarity of a woman who had been thinking carefully about something and had finally found a listener. She walked him through the settlement currency problem, the exchange rate exposure, the proposed language she'd drafted to replace the original clause with something symmetrical. She explained the commission structure she planned to counter-propose and why, and what she expected Vasiliev's response to be, and how she planned to respond to that response. Richard listened, completely, without interrupting, without reaching for the first question that came to him in order to demonstrate that he was following. He simply listened, and when she was finished, he asked the question that was actually there, rather than the one he'd been holding. "The Bordeaux contact," he said. "Your mother's family's connection. Have you told Vasiliev about that?" She paused. "Not yet," she said. "Would it be useful?" She considered. "If the Vasiliev arrangement performs the way I expect," she said slowly, "and if the Atlantic routes develop the way I believe they will over the next 5 years, yes. The Bordeaux connection could become very useful. There's a French merchant house there that has relationships with trading operations across the Mediterranean that the Russian network doesn't touch." "Mediterranean," he said. "Olive oil, wine, specialty textiles." She looked at him carefully. "Not tobacco, not timber. Different markets entirely." "New markets," he said. "New markets," she agreed. He sat back. I was doing the thing he had been doing all week. The uncomfortable necessary thing of allowing himself to see the full shape of what had been living in his house for 6 years without his knowledge. The Baltic connections, the Whitfield network, the Bordeaux contact, the analytical work that had circulated in 3 countries under a name that was not fully hers. All of it patient, all of it still there, all of it waiting for the moment when someone finally thought to ask. "Helen," he said. She looked at him. "I have been a fool," he said. "Not a villain, not cruel, but a fool. And I think there is a particular kind of damage that fools do that is harder to repair than the damage villains do, because at least a villain knows what he's doing, and the people around him can see it clearly and protect themselves accordingly." He kept his eyes on hers. "A fool just doesn't look, and the people around him slowly stop expecting to be seen, and that is the damage I have done." The candles on the library desk had burned down an inch since they started. Outside, the Virginia summer held its heat even in the evening, the kind of warmth that settles into old wood and brick, and doesn't entirely leave until well past midnight. Helen did not look away. "Yes," she said. "That is the damage you have done." No softening, no relief for either of them in a gentler formulation. Just the plain, clean truth of it accepted by both parties. "Then we know what we're repairing," he said. She picked up her pen. "We know what we're repairing," she said, and she went back to the counteroffer. He stayed at the desk. He pulled the tobacco ledger toward him and opened it to the shipping column and began to read through it with the specific attention of a man who has been told he doesn't look and is now looking, and the room held both of them in the candlelight, working not together yet. Not in the full sense, not the way trust allows, but in the same direction. Which was not where they had been a week ago. And that for now was enough to build on. The Vasiliev contract was signed on a Tuesday morning in September, 6 weeks after the dinner that had changed everything. Richard signed it. His name appeared on the legal documentation as the law required married women in Virginia in 1817 did not sign commercial contracts, and Helen had no illusions about that reality. But Vasiliev's secretary Fedorov had added a line to the commercial correspondence annex at Helen's request and Richard's insistence. a line that identified H.L. Winthrop as the primary analyst and advisor, and that specified her name would appear on all assessments reports and recommendations produced under the arrangement. It was a small line. It mattered enormously. Helen signed her initials beside it in her careful hand, and Fedorov witnessed it, and Korolev, who had traveled from Richmond specifically for the signing, looked at the document afterward with the expression of a man who understood that he had just participated in something that was going to produce excellent commercial results and also possibly a minor administrative precedent. "My wife in St. Petersburg," Korolev said quietly to Richard, while Helen and Vasiliev discussed the first assignment, "manages our household accounts with a precision that I find frankly superior to my own. I have never told her so." Richard looked at him. "Tell her," he said. Korolev turned back to the room where his ambassador and this Virginia planter's wife were deep in technical conversation about Atlantic freight rates. He watched them for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I think I will." The first assignment under the Vasiliev arrangement was an assessment of 3 proposed American trading partnerships that the Russian House was evaluating for the following year's Atlantic season. Helen worked on it for 2 weeks in the library, at the desk that had become by quiet and mutual understanding primarily hers. Richard came in each morning with his coffee and asked what she needed, which was sometimes a specific document from the county records, sometimes a piece of commercial intelligence from Whitfield's network, and once memorably, an introduction to a Baltimore merchant named Hargreaves, whom Richard knew socially, and who turned out to have detailed knowledge of one of the proposed partnerships that confirmed Helen's suspicion that the partnership was structured to benefit the American broker significantly more than the Russian principal. "You want me to have dinner with Hargreaves," Richard said when she explained what she needed. "I want you to have dinner with Hargreaves and ask him casually what he thinks of the Delacroix trading operation in Boston." She looked up from the desk. "He'll tell you everything. He and Delacroix had a dispute 2 years ago over a commission arrangement, and Hargreaves has been waiting for someone to ask his opinion ever since." Richard stared at her. "How do you know about the dispute?" "Whitfield," she said simply. "He mentioned it in last spring's letter. I had dinner with Hargreaves the following week. Hargreaves told him everything, considerably more than everything, with the enthusiasm of a man releasing a long-held grievance to a willing ear." Richard returned to the estate with 4 pages of notes in his coat pocket, and a new appreciation for the fact that his wife's intelligence network functioned in part by accurately predicting what aggrieved people needed in order to speak freely. The Delacroix partnership was removed from the Russian House's consideration based on Helen's assessment, which documented the structural concerns with a precision that Korolev, reviewing it in Richmond, described in a letter to Vasiliev as "the clearest commercial analysis I have received from an American source." Vasiliev wrote to Helen directly. He addressed the letter to Mrs. H.L. Winthrop, commercial advisor, which was not a standard form of address for a woman in Virginia in 1817, and which caused a brief and entirely satisfying disruption when it arrived at the Winthrop estate post, and the young man who delivered it asked for the first time in the 6 years he'd been handling the estate's mail whether Mrs. Winthrop was at home to receive correspondence. Helen received the letter in the front hall. Richard was there when it arrived. He watched his wife read a formal commercial communication addressed to her in her own house, in her own name, and something settled in him. Not satisfaction exactly, and not pride in the way a man feels pride in something he built. Something quieter. Something more like witnessing. The feeling of being present for a moment that was always going to happen, that had always been waiting to happen, that had simply been delayed by years of not looking. I was glad he was here for it now. He was not going to waste that gladness by claiming any credit for it. The social landscape of Albemarle County reorganized itself around the new reality, with the particular efficiency of a community that prefers clarity to ambiguity. The initial murmuring, the careful sideways commentary of people processing something that didn't fit their existing categories, subsided within a month, driven partly by the visible success of the Vasiliev arrangement, and partly by the simple social arithmetic that Margaret Forsythe had calculated and acted on the day after the dinner. Forsythe's endorsement mattered in Virginia. She had the social standing of 3 generations and the decisive quality of a woman who had long since stopped caring whether people agreed with her assessments, only whether they were accurate. She had assessed Helen Winthrop as someone worth knowing. She said so, repeatedly. In tea rooms and parlors and writing parties, and the 100 small venues through which Virginia opinion moved and settled. Anne Caldwell, whose friendship with Helen predated everything, and whose enthusiasm knew no moderation, told anyone who would listen that she had always known, and that honestly, if people had been paying attention, they would have known too, which was not entirely accurate, but was said with such conviction that it became in the retelling a kind of retroactive communal wisdom. The men were more complicated. Some of them managed the adjustment by focusing on the commercial success and attributing it mentally to the general sound management of a well-run Winthrop operation, which allowed them to acknowledge the outcome without fully confronting the mechanism. Richard recognized this maneuver because he had been performing it himself for years, and he found he had no patience for it in others. When James Caldwell, Anne's husband, a pleasant man of moderate intelligence and considerable self-satisfaction, congratulated Richard at a county meeting on the Vasiliev arrangement and said that it spoke well of his judgment in commercial matters. Richard looked at him levelly and said, "The commercial judgment is my wife's. My contribution was being willing to listen to it, which I should have been doing years ago." Caldwell blinked. "Well," he said. "Yes, of course." He moved away with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had expected one kind of conversation and received an entirely different kind, and Richard returned to the meeting without further comment, and the story made its way through Albemarle County by the following week, with the speed that stories achieve when they confirm something people are already half thinking. Old Pendleton, who heard everything, eventually sent Richard a note with 2 lines. "You are a better man than I gave you credit for being. I'm rarely wrong, but I'm glad when I am." Richard put the note in his desk drawer beside Clara's letter, which was still there, which he kept not as sentiment, but as a document, a record of a chapter he intended to remain finished. The eastern field drainage was corrected in October. The tobacco yield in the following spring was the best the estate had produced in 4 years. Helen said nothing about this when the harvest numbers came in, which Richard understood as a form of mercy. The numbers spoke clearly enough, and she was not a woman who needed to add words to a point that had already been made. He added the words himself. He came to the library on the morning the final harvest figures were tallied, and he set the ledger on the desk in front of her, and he said, "You were right about the eastern field. You were right in 1815, and I should have listened then." She looked at the numbers. "We recovered it," she said. "A year later than we should have." "Yes." She closed the ledger. "But we recovered it." He sat across from her. "Is that how you think about it?" he asked. "The things that were delayed, the things that were lost. Is that how you carry them, as recovered rather than as lost?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything, without rushing to an answer that would make either of them more comfortable. "I think both things are true," she said. "Some things were lost and cannot be recovered. Some things were delayed and have been recovered. The question is, which category each thing falls into, and I am still—" A pause. "I am still sorting." He received that without flinching. "The lost things," he said. "Can you tell me what they are, not so that I can argue with the categorization, so that I know?" She looked at him steadily for a long moment. The assessment, the measuring. He had come to recognize it, not as coldness, but as exactness, the expression of a woman who did not spend words she didn't mean and was determining how many she actually meant. 3 years of the Baltic correspondence, she said, done in private in the evenings while you were in the study. The Archangel analysis in 1814, done alone, credited elsewhere. The Harmon contract, 4 years of paying terms. I knew were disadvantageous because I had no mechanism to change them. She paused. The winter of 1814, when I sat in the parlor with Crane's carriage leaving, and I understood clearly that my work would always be invisible in this house, and I made myself decide to stay anyway. Another pause. That winter cost me something I don't entirely have a word for. He held the weight of it. I'm sorry for that winter, he said, specifically, for the thing you don't have a word for. She nodded. Once. It was not absolution. He did not want absolution. Absolution would have been too easy and too fast, and it would have asked her to do work that was his to do. What it was acknowledgement. She had heard him. She was marking it. That was its own kind of grace. "The Vasiliev commission from the first quarter," she said, shifting the way she shifted directly and without ceremony, from the emotional to the practical, which he had initially read as avoidance, and had come to understand as simply the way her mind moved horizontal and fast between the things that needed attending to. "It came in yesterday." "I know, I saw it. I want to use a portion of it to hire a corresponding clerk," she said. "My own, not shared with Crane's office. Someone who manages the commercial correspondence under my direction." He sat up slightly. This was new. Not in the sense of being unexpected. He had watched her work long enough now to understand that each piece of authority she established became the ground for the next, but in the sense of being a specific formal organizational claim that had not been made before. "Your own clerk," he said. "The volume of correspondence is beyond what I can manage alone, now that the Vasiliev arrangement is operational," she said. "And I have 3 other assessments pending, one from Whitfield's referral in Boston, one from the Bordeaux contact which I told you about in September, and one that arrived last week from a Baltimore merchant house that heard about the Delacroix assessment through Korolev." She looked at him with the level, expectant gaze of a woman presenting a business case to someone she expects to engage with it seriously. "I need staff." He did not hesitate. "Hire whoever you need," he said. "Put the cost against the commercial operations accounts, not the household accounts. Separate line." She noted something on the paper in front of her. "Separate line," she confirmed. Outside the library window, the autumn had settled properly into Virginia, the particular quality of October light that makes everything look like a painting of itself, warm and amber and slightly too beautiful to be entirely real. Richard didn't look at it. He kept his eyes on his wife, who was writing a note to herself in the margin of a document, and whose expression was the focused, contained expression of a person doing work they are good at and know they are good at. He had a question he had been carrying for 2 months. He had been waiting for the right moment and had finally understood that with Helen there was no right moment in the social sense. There was only the moment when the question was ready to be honest and the space between them was clear enough to hold it. "The night of the dinner," he said. "When you walked up the stairs." She looked up. "You knew what was going to happen," he said. "With Vasiliev. You knew he was coming, and you had probably already considered that he might know your work." She set down her pen. "I knew there was a chance," she said carefully. "Did you arrange it?" The question hung. Her expression was complicated, not guilty, not evasive, but the particular expression of a person deciding how much precision a truthful answer requires. "I did not arrange for Vasiliev to attend your dinner," she said. "That was your arrangement through your Richmond contacts." A beat. "I did write to Whitfield in July and mention that the Russian ambassador would be traveling through Virginia and that my husband was attempting to arrange an introduction. Whitfield mentioned to Vasiliev's commercial attaché that there was a Langford-connected household in Albemarle County that might be of interest." Richard was very still. "Whitfield told the Russian delegation to look for you." "Whitfield told them the county was worth a stop," she said. "What happened at the dinner that was not arranged?" "That was the conversation going where the conversation went when someone finally asked me a question worth answering." He turned the information over carefully. She had not engineered the dinner. She had not manipulated the outcome. What she had done was something more subtle and more honest. She had maintained a network, kept her relationships alive, allowed information to travel through channels she trusted. She had not orchestrated Vasiliev's bow. She had simply made sure Vasiliev knew enough to be in the room. That was not manipulation. That was exactly what he had failed to do for 6 years. Maintain the relationships, keep the channels open, ensure that the people worth knowing eventually found their way to the people worth knowing them. "You are better at this than I am," he said. "At the actual work of commerce. The relationships, the analysis, the long-term positioning." "In some ways," she said evenly, "you are better at other things." "Name one." She considered. "You are better at walking into a room of strangers and commanding their attention," she said. "That is a genuine skill, and I do not have it in the same degree. You have 30 years of social authority in this county that opens doors I cannot open from the inside." She paused. "We are more useful together than either of us is alone. That has always been true. It simply was not arranged that way." He let the word land, arranged. The deliberate choice of a woman who understood that most of what people called natural was actually constructed, and that what was constructed poorly could be reconstructed differently. "Then let's arrange it properly," he said. She held his gaze. "That will take time," she said. "I have time." "It will require consistency," she said. "Not effort for a month and then old habits. Consistency. Over years." "I understand. And there will be moments," she said, "when you revert. When you reach past me for the decision rather than to me for the discussion. When you forget. When the old arrangements feel more natural than the new ones because they have 20 years of practice behind them and these have 2 months. She was not threatening. She was precise. "When that happens, and it will happen, I need you to catch it yourself. I cannot be the one who corrects you every time. That is not a marriage. That is a position I have already held for 6 years, and I am not interested in holding again." The room absorbed that. He felt it, the full specific weight of what she was asking. Not forgiveness, and not reconciliation, which were both things that happened in a moment. She was asking for something harder, sustained attention. The kind that doesn't require maintenance from the person it's owed to. The kind that a man has to build into his own habits, rather than relying on his wife to remind him to have. "All right," he said. She picked up her pen. He did not move to leave. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "Anne Caldwell's husband, Caldwell." He paused. "He has a standing in the county that I have. He has commercial interests that interact with ours on 3 fronts: timber boundary, tobacco market, and the Richmond merchant network. He is currently managed by Crane's office in a way that is, I believe, considerably less efficiently than it could be." Helen looked at him. "You want to propose to Caldwell that his commercial correspondence be assessed through our operation," she said. "Through you," he said. "Not through me. I can make the introduction. I can sit in the room. But the proposition is yours, and the arrangement would be yours, and Caldwell would understand that from the beginning." She was quiet for a long moment. I watched her work through it, the commercial logic, the social calculation, the assessment of risk versus opportunity, that she performed faster and more accurately than anyone he had ever met in 30 years of Virginia commerce. "Caldwell is proud," she said finally. "He is. He will struggle with the arrangement. Initially. His wife will tell him to stop struggling," she said. And something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but its immediate neighbor. Richard felt it land in his chest, like the first genuinely warm thing in a very long time. "She will," he agreed. "Anne Caldwell is not a patient woman with foolish pride." Helen set down her pen and straightened the documents on the desk into their precise order. It was a gesture he recognized, the gesture of a person closing the current chapter of work and preparing to open the next one. "Have Caldwell to dinner," she said. "Next month. Anne as well. Keep it small, just the 4 of us." She stood. "And this time seat me correctly." He stood. "You'll be at my left," he said, "where you have always belonged." The expression that crossed her face then was not the composed neutral she had worn for 6 years, like a second skin. It was not the careful management of a woman who had learned to expect nothing. It was something real and unguarded and slightly imperfect. The expression of a person who has received something they had stopped hoping for and is not yet entirely sure what to do with it. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen on her face. He did not say that. I didn't need to. She saw him see it, and that was the thing that mattered. Not the words, but the witnessing. The actual present sustained witnessing of the person standing in front of him. She moved toward the door. "I'll write to the Boston referral this afternoon," she said. "And I want to review the Bordeaux contact's terms before the end of the week." She paused in the doorway, not with hesitation, but with the particular pause of a woman who has something more to say and is deciding whether the moment is right for it. She decided it was. "Richard," she turned. "When Pendleton asks you at the next county meeting, and he will ask you because he asks everyone, everything eventually, How the estate is doing what it is you actually say. He understood the question beneath the question. I say my wife built half of what you see here, he said. And I say it was always true. I simply didn't know it soon enough. She looked at him for one long, clear moment. Then she walked out of the library, through the house she had managed for 6 years, and was only now beginning to truly own toward the work that had always been hers, and was finally being called by her name. The Winthrop estate ran differently after that autumn. Not dramatically. There was no single announcement, no formal reorganization that would have scandalized the county. It happened the way real change happens, which is gradually, and then all at once, through accumulated small decisions that quietly rearrange the underlying structure of a thing, until one day someone looks at it and realizes it has become something different from what it was. Helen's commercial operation grew. The Boston referral became a standing arrangement. The Bordeaux contact opened 3 inquiries that led to 2 formal assessments, and 1 significant recommendation that the French merchant house implemented in the spring of 1818, with results that justified a second letter of commendation from Korolev. The Caldwell dinner happened in November. Anne announced within the first 20 minutes that her husband was going to make an agreement with Helen before the dessert course was served. Caldwell protested for exactly as long as his pride required, and the arrangement was made before the dessert course was served. Whitfield visited Virginia in the spring of 1818, the first time Helen had seen him in 4 years, the first time Richard had met him. He was a short, precise man in his 50s, with the observational quality of someone who had made a career of noticing what other people missed. He spent 2 hours with Helen reviewing the Atlantic market conditions, and 1 hour with Richard discussing the tobacco market. And when he was leaving, he stopped at the door and looked at Richard with the direct assessment of a man who had been waiting to form an opinion. She has been doing this level of work for 8 years, Whitfield said, since she was 23 years old, in case you were wondering about the timeline. Richard held the older man's gaze. I wasn't wondering, he said. I already know I was late. Whitfield studied him for a moment longer. Good, he said. Men who know they were late are more useful than men who are still calculating whether they were late at all. He put on his hat. You have an exceptional wife, Mr. Winthrop. I trust you intend to deserve her. He walked out before Richard could answer. Richard stood in the doorway and watched the man's carriage move down the Winthrop Drive, and behind him, the house was full of the sounds of a working morning. Helen's voice from the library, discussing the spring assessment with the young clerk she had hired in November. A capable young man named Foster, who had learned within his first week that Mrs. Winthrop's instructions were precise. Her expectations were high, and her tolerance for imprecision was approximately 0, and who had responded to all 3 of these things with the enthusiastic efficiency of someone who had found exactly the kind of work he was built for. Richard turned back into the house. He passed the library, heard Helen correcting something in Foster's draft with the particular clarity of a teacher who makes correction feel like information rather than failure, and he kept walking through the hall and into the east wing and out to the tobacco barn, where the spring planting preparations were underway. He had work to do. Different work than before, not smaller, not less important, but genuinely different in that it was his and not hers, and it required him to do it rather than assuming someone else was handling it quietly in the background. The social relationships, the county networks, the Richmond merchant contacts, the physical management of the estate operations. These were his, and he was doing them with the specific sustained attention of a man who has learned what inattention costs and is not going to pay that price again. They worked in parallel now, and they worked together, and the distinction between the two was something they had built carefully over the months since September. The understanding of which decisions were individual and which were shared, and the habit of asking before assuming, and the daily ordinary unglamorous practice of 2 people choosing to see each other. It was not a perfect arrangement. There were mornings when the old habit surfaced, when Richard reached for a decision that belonged to the shared space between them, and Helen's expression tightened by a fraction, and he caught it and corrected. There were evenings when the accumulated weight of 6 years sat between them, and neither of them had the energy to navigate it, and they simply sat in the same room in a silence that was complicated rather than peaceful. There were conversations that opened old ground and required both of them to stand in it without retreating, which was the hardest thing of all. But they did it, and they did it again. And gradually, the way real things change, not all at once, but in the patient accumulation of days. The ground between them became something they had both chosen and both built, rather than something one of them had been silently maintaining while the other looked away. Winthrop Estate, in the summer of 1819, was a different house from the one it had been 2 years before. Not in the materials. The same brick, the same timber, the same white columns along the front porch that Richard had built in his 20s to be seen from the road. But the life inside it had changed in ways that mattered more than architecture. Helen's name was on 3 commercial agreements. Her correspondence went out under her own initials to merchant houses in 4 cities and 2 countries, and they wrote back to her with the respect owed to someone whose assessments had proven accurate and whose recommendations had proven sound. Vasiliev had returned to Russia, but Korolev maintained the relationship actively, and the second year's commission had exceeded the first by 30%. On an afternoon in July, a young woman from the county, the daughter of a neighbor 18 years old, clearly intelligent, clearly confined, arrived with her mother for a social call that turned, as social calls sometimes do, when the right people are present, into something more honest than anyone had planned. The girl asked Helen with the direct urgency of someone who had been holding a question for a long time how she had learned to do what she did. Helen looked at her. "I read everything I could find," she said, "and I did not wait for someone to invite me to begin." The girl went home with 2 books and 3 letters of introduction to corresponding merchants in the Whitfield network, which Helen wrote on the spot, with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned not to waste the moments when the door is open. Her mother was slightly overwhelmed. Richard, who had been in the room, was not. He had watched his wife hand those letters to a girl who reminded him sharply and without comfort of what Helen had been at 18, the capability, the intelligence, the specific hunger of a mind that could see far and was not yet sure it would be allowed to look. He hoped the girl's life moved faster than Helen's had. He hoped the people around her learned to look sooner than he had. That evening, when the visitors were gone and the house was quiet, and Helen was at the library desk with the summer light running low across the papers, Richard came in and sat across from her and did not open a ledger or pick up a document. He simply sat. She looked up. "Pendleton asked me yesterday," he said, "how the estate was doing." She waited. "I told him my wife built half of what he sees here," he said, "and that I was late to understand it, but I understood it now, and that the second half she was building was going to be greater than the first." Helen held his gaze. "Was he surprised?" she asked. "No," Richard said. "He told me he'd known since the dinner. He said the only person in that room who hadn't known was me." She looked at him for a long moment. The real look. The unmanaged one. The one that had been appearing more frequently in these past 2 years, and that he had learned to receive without trying to shape or redirect it. "Then you are the last to know," she said, "and the only one who needed to." She turned back to her work, and Richard Winthrop sat across from his wife in the house he had built, and she had made worth living in, and he understood finally fully, without reservation, that the most valuable thing on Winthrop Estate had never been the tobacco or the timber, or the 40 disputed acres to the east, or the imported chandelier from Philadelphia, or the columns visible from the road. It had always been her. It had always been Helen. He had simply needed a Russian ambassador to bow before he finally looked up and saw it. He was done looking away.